So after we learn the basics of the type tool, I want to now talk about some of the more advanced things we can start to do with the tool. Namely, how we can start to change the distance, the leading, the kerning, as well as the kind of forced faux font families, as we kind of previously mentioned in the last tutorial, to make our fonts bold, italic, and kind of stretch and change their size. So let's go ahead and jump on in and I'll show you guys what we can do. So once we have our text laid out, we've chosen our font, we've chosen the size, the color, the justification, we've placed it in our artboard. I want to show you guys now how we can move on to adjust some different things about the characters of our text. Now, up in the right side, the upper right corner of your workspace, you should see these two little icons here. One looks like an A with a line next to it, and one looks like the paragraph marker. Now, if you don't see these, go up to Window in your menu bar, and you will see the Character panel and the Paragraph panel, which those two icons represent. Either way, go ahead and open up your Character panel first. Now, once you open this panel, you'll notice that there are a lot of the same properties to change as we saw in our option bar in the last tutorial. Here we can change the font, we can change the font size, we can change the color. If you change them here in the character panel, it will also change them up here in the option bar. But what the character panel gives us is some extra parameters to change. Now, in typical Adobe fashion, if you don't know what these icons mean, you don't necessarily know what you're changing. So let's talk about these. Go ahead and double click your T to highlight your text so we can get started with some changes. Now let's first look at this VA icon here. It's a VA in a white box with a left and right facing arrow. If you hover over it, it says set the tracking for the selected characters. Now tracking, if you pull down the pull down here, is the space between the individual characters of your text. So the space between the F and the O here, for example. Now it defaults to 0 because that's just the standard distance per this font. And then we can go in the negative or we can go in the positive. Positives spread the space between the characters out more. Going in the negative condenses the space between those characters. Now, just like our text size, we're not limited to the numbers here. We can use this VA as a slider. Now, if I click and drag this to the left, you can see I can cram the space between those characters almost to a fault. And likewise, to the right, we can start to spread these out a lot. Now, I've always been a huge fan of small fonts, heavily tracked. It makes it really cinematic. Now, it's not that tracking is terribly exciting, but what it does is it gives us full flexibility to begin to manipulate how our text looks on screen. This communicates something a lot different than this. Same font, different size, different tracking. So we need to understand that the way we adjust our text is more than just font. So that's tracking. I'm going to keep this at 0 just for now, and I'll make my text a bit smaller. Now let's say I had each of these words on separate lines. I'm just going to click here next to them and hit enter or the return key on my keyboard. And notice now that the space between return lines is too small, meaning my words are crammed into their neighbors. This now means we have to change the spacing between line returns. And this is the double stacked A icon with the upward and downward facing arrow. This is the leading. Now, like our tracking, we have our pull down ranging from 6, which again crams them closer together, down to 72, which gives it some space, but that space is not enough by default. And so I can use the stacked A's and the little arrow as a slider, and so by clicking and dragging to the right, I can begin to change the spacing between my words. That looks pretty good there. Now I'm going to double click my T icon again to highlight my text. So that's the tracking and the leading, two very important adjustments for any fonts that we're working with. Now, I firmly believe that anytime you guys are working with text, you should try to adjust the tracking and the leading just to see what it does. Sometimes you discover some happy accidents by adjusting these settings. Now let's jump down to these big T's with the upward and downward facing arrow and the side to side facing arrow, each set to 100%. Now these are a way to forcefully scale your text after you've written it out. Meaning, if I want my text to be a little taller, I can by stretching the percentage, or I can make it squattier by decreasing the percentage. Likewise, I can go over to my horizontal scale and I can stretch the text out, or I could cram it together. Now, I'm not a huge fan of these adjustments. I've always felt it's kind of like disproportionately scaling in free transform. You never necessarily want to squish something. It doesn't look good. But sometimes I have fonts that I like a lot, and I want to adjust them to where they're a bit more in line with what I want them to be. Meaning maybe they look just a tad too tall, and so by adjusting the vertical scale just like 3 or 4%, I can perfectly kind of manipulate that font to be what I'm looking for. So use these horizontal and vertical scales carefully, but they're there to fine-tune things if you need them. I'm using a font called United Sans. If I toggle this down, you can see that United Sans comes with a pretty large family. United Sans Black, Heavy, Bold, Medium, Light, and Thin. Not every font has this many members of the family. So depending on what font you guys have during this exercise, yours may just say one of these things. It may say regular or italic. If I were to use a different font, maybe something less... something more fancy. You can see this font,
Action Jackson,
only has one member of the family, regular. So what happens then if I want to italicize
Action Jackson,
if I want to make it bold or I want to make it underlined? These are things that we have to then come to our character panel to do. There's this row of T icons right here. These are your faux family members, meaning if your font doesn't come with a bold option, this first T here is a faux bold, forcefully making your font bold. Likewise, we have a faux italics, faux all caps, and some of these won't work for every font. Superscript, subscript, underline, and strike through. For whatever reason, people like strike through. So these are great if you have a thin font and you just want to add that extra oomph of thickness to the line, and it doesn't come with a bold option. Now be careful, because some of these, either they don't work or they work, but they kind of start to distort the font a little bit. Notice how I start to lose the dimensionality of this particular font in terms of the shadows. So use these carefully, but they're there if you need them. Now our paragraph tab, if we jump all the way over here, our paragraph tab is just a place to more accurately refine our justifications and our margins. This is really handy if you guys are making like a poster or some kind of document that needs specific margins. But for this exercise and for this class, we're not going to really use the paragraph tab outside of its regular justification settings. So what I want you guys to do is I want you guys to find a font. And I want you guys to make it to where you like the way it's laid out. Change its color, change its font, play with the tracking and the leading, see if any of the faux family members are good options, and get that situated the way you like it. Because then what we're going to do is we're going to come back and we're going to continue to work with the option bar with some of the settings there that we haven't talked about yet. So get your font there, and then we'll continue on. All right, so now we're going to talk about the option bar and the last few options that we haven't discussed yet. Go ahead and double click your T icon to highlight your text. Let's come up here to this slanted T with this semicircle underneath it. This is a warped text option. Click on that. Now, warped text can very quickly begin to look like bad clip art. We should use warped text minimally, if at all, but I want you guys to know that it's there. Now, underneath the style pull down, we see some different options, as well as the example of what those options do to your text. I have used these to add just a hint of change or some warped style to my text. But in large changes, these can look pretty cheesy. So for example, arc. There's a bend option here. And notice that when I go to full 100% on the bend, I've just lost all style for my text. It looks terrible, and the negative is true as well. But if I had just maybe like a +10, right? You can see how it just starts to warp that a little bit in a way that if I had maybe a different graphic, it could follow the curvature of that graphic. We also have our horizontal distortion and our vertical distortion. And so some of these are kind of fun, but they can start to look cheap really quickly. Some ones to highlight, I've used bulge, and I like flag. Flag is kind of a nice way to, if I reset these again, flag is kind of a nice way to add just a bit of gentle curve to your text. You can see that would have made that look decent. But all in all, the warp text features should be carefully applied, much like our horizontal and vertical scales in our character panel. So play with warp text, because for those of you that really would like your text to look like a fish, you now have that option. But please don't make your text look like a fish. Now the rest of the things up here in the option bar, we have our character and paragraph panel toggle on and off is just another way to access these panels. We have the apply or reject any changes that we've made to our text. Hitting enter on the keyboard does that as well. And then we have the 3D text feature. If you guys want to experiment with this, you totally can. It's not relevant to this class, so I'm not going to get into it, but it's fun to play with. There are plenty of good tutorials online that will cover the ins and outs of 3D text in Photoshop. So in the last two tutorials, we've now covered the ins and outs of the type tool, the options in the option bar, as well as the character and paragraph panels. Review this information if necessary, because in the next tutorial, we're going to start to learn how to use what we've learned already with our pen tool and direct selection tool and begin to manipulate fonts even further.